Hello students and welcome to the second part of chapter 10. In this section we will discuss how notions of what is moral and ethical does not necessarily translate across national borders. Globalization of business activities calls for a level playing field, that is, an area where the rules of the game are clearly spelled out and apply to everyone. Embedded in this imperative are the assumptions of universalism and fairness. For example, it assumes that being fair means giving equal opportunities and access to markets, not playing favorites, not protecting home interests. It also implies that everyone should get what they call their fair share, which makes sense in cultures that are driven by an instrumental motive. But how do these assumptions apply in cultures that are relationship driven and rely on personal networks, where belonging is more important than performing? After all, what does equal access or fair share, for example, mean in the context of a family, and more specifically in the relationship between a parent and a child? Also, what exactly is fair? Should China, for example, have the same anti-polluting laws as are applicable now in the US? Why or why not? Some might argue that pollution is pollution. It doesn't matter if the US is creating it or China is creating it, it's harming our environment, and therefore all countries need to have limits as to how much they can pollute in the world. Others, on the other hand, contend that the US has had a huge head start with industrialization in this country happening decades ago. And when industrialization in the US first started, nobody was stopping the US from creating all the pollution that they did in order to achieve economic success. And therefore, to shut down other countries now, when they are struggling to come out of poverty and also become more developed, may seem unfair to those countries. Also, what should the minimum wage in a country be? Should a country use child labor or not? These are all ethically laden questions that managers have to contend with when crossing borders. When it comes to the question of whether we can have the ideas of morality and personal self-interest be mutually exclusive or not, there seems to be some differing views out there. For example, one camp says that no free society or free economy can survive long without an ethical base, a shared moral foundation, a set of binding rules of fair conduct. They see such rules as not just a luxury, but as sound business ethic, essential to the preservation of free enterprise. However, many Asian leaders reject such Western liberal democratic ideas, insisting that the economic growth in the Asian way, which is seen as unethical in the Western world, is ethical when looked at from their lens. They say that full democracy, as understood by the West, would essentially lead to chaos. Freedom of expression is undesirable in certain Asian countries because it encourages instability and could provoke conflict between ethnic groups. Therefore, they see the rights of individuals as something that needs to be respected, but only insofar as they do not impinge on the greater rights of the community as a whole. In other words, what the community needs or the nation needs is more important than what each individual needs. Such Asian countries claim that the West should stop arrogantly trying to impose inappropriate Western standards of human rights, democracy, environmental protectionism, etc. on Asia, especially since Asia is on the rise and they say the West is on the decline. Having said that, China decided to join the World Trade Organization and also recently hosted the Olympics and therefore required some compliance with more Western standards. Therefore, the push towards globalization is causing cultural shocks in the way business is conducted around the world and causing more and more countries to share the meaning of what it means to be ethical. Let's now discuss how globalization has affected businesses. Many practices formerly considered business as usual are now coming under public scrutiny in both Europe and Asia, and thus practices that were considered business as usual are not acceptable anymore. When ethical boundaries are crossed, managers from one country might end up in jail in another country or even in their own country, as was the case with the CEO of a French conglomerate who found himself locked up in a Belgian jail. The Clean Hands campaign launched in Italy in the 1990s caused the resignation of several top company and country officials, including ex-Prime Minister, as well as the suicides of several prominent businessmen because their corrupt business practices were uncovered. In Asia, there have been several banking scandals in Japan and bribery and corruption scandals in India and South Korea that seriously shook up the economies and political stabilities in these countries. Thus, the globalization imperative has challenged fundamental business as well as cultural assumptions in many countries. In other words, because of globalization, more eyes are looking at every country and how they do things, and thus corrupt practices are not acceptable anymore. Japanese banks are known to always cherish customer relationships, even if these customers are questionable people, like the Japanese mafia. In the past, pre-globalization, the relationship with the customer, irrespective of who the customer was a priority. But now, due to globalization and an increased scrutiny in the way Japanese banks are conducting business and whom they're conducting business with, these long-held relationships with questionable customers are breaking down, as are long-standing relationships between banks and companies in Germany, where banks would know exactly what would happen in a company and therefore be involved in insider trading. Even the close ties between companies and government in France is being challenged due to globalization. Thus, throughout the world, a public outcry has challenged long-entrenched social power structures, resulting in the growing demand for greater transparency and accountability to public interest. In Japan, for example, this greater concern is attributed to the increasing vote and louder voice of women in Japanese society. Such cultural and political upheaval is partly due to globalization and people trying to establish a shared meaning of what it means to be ethical and socially responsible across the world. Throughout history, philosophers have been arguing about what should be the right criteria for determining ethical behavior. Should it be the greatest good for the greatest number of people, what we call utilitarianism, or should it, for example, be rights-based? And if it's rights-based, then whose rights should we be considering? Should we look at rights as given to somebody due to where they fall in the hierarchy, that is, what their role is, like it is in France? Or should it be the rights that are given to an individual due to contracts, as it is in the United States? Or should it be rights that are given to an individual due to consensus, or everybody agreeing, as it is in the Netherlands? Philosophers have argued that there exists a natural law that transcends national boundaries, which encompasses the preservation of life, the promotion of family life and orderly social life, and the quest for knowledge. Cultures share similarities on what they think is ethical and then have some differences. What are the reasons for the similarities that we see amongst cultures in terms of what they think is ethical and what they don't? The reasons that cultures might be similar to each other in terms of ethical values is that most cultures, if not all, care about fairness and honesty. They care about a concern for their customers, suppliers, and community. However, the legal and cultural context of each country can create differences in how cultures view ethics. So really, societies differ in terms of what they find acceptable and what they don't, depending on what controls them, shame or guilt. In Asian countries, for example, morality is more likely to be defined in terms of others, in terms of an interdependence rather than independence. Mothers, for example, coax their children to eat vegetables by having them consider the feelings of the farmer who produced them. Further, notions of reciprocity in Asian cultures result in common practices of gift giving and exchanging favors, of saving face and giving face. Shame, therefore, serves as a really powerful form of social control in Asian countries. Not living up to obligations results in being seen as unreliable and might lead to ostracism or to being shut out. In contrast, America has a Protestant heritage that encourages individual moral scrutiny and self-criticism, and thus ethics is considered in the US as a question of personal scruples, a confidential matter between the person and their conscience. In other words, feelings of guilt rather than shame controls people in the US. And morality is based on having to live with yourself and being able to sleep at night, doing the right thing. So you can see yourself in the mirror, not because you're worried about what somebody else will think about you. Let's compare the United States and Hong Kong. These two countries have very different attitudes towards patent protection and price fixing, but almost all managers agree on reporting defective or unsafe products to superiors even if their job was potentially jeopardized. Surveys done in these two countries revealed that 94% of people in Hong Kong and 99% of people in the US will report defective products. However, which country do you think is more likely to blow the whistle on their own company if it's creating defective products? If you guess the US, then you are right. This is because in Hong Kong, they try to save face, both their own and others, and wouldn't want to shame anybody, and therefore they are less inclined towards whistleblowing. In the US, managers were more likely to consult with their bosses while trying to resolve an ethical dilemma, while in Hong Kong, managers were more likely to discuss an ethical issue with a friend rather than with a boss. What do you think both groups said was the most important influence on deciding whether or not to be ethical? Factors that managers from each of these countries considered when thinking about whether to contribute to unethical behavior or not was the behavior of their supervisors, such that if their bosses or supervisors were ethical, then they were also ethical, and they were more likely to do something unethical if they saw their bosses doing so. With that, we come to an end of the second part of chapter 10. In the third part, we will continue our discussion by comparing US with Europe in terms of ethical codes of conduct. Thank you.